Hi, my name's Harper West, and I'm a clinical psychologist in Michigan, and I'm an expert in shame. And this is the third in a series of videos about shame, specifically clinical case formulation using a shame-informed model. And the previous sections, we talked about the DSM and how it has many flaws and how a shame-informed case formulation model would be much more healthy, much more productive and efficient for our clients. And compassion-based interventions would be the natural outcome from that model. And then we talked about shame and what that emotion is and how it's a pro-social emotion. And so this time we're going to start talking about these 5 causative factors that increase or exacerbate poor shame tolerance. Okay. So you can see the third bullet here is shame. So if you haven't watched the video on shame, you might want to go back and watch that because that is one of these 5 factors, and we're not going to repeat that lesson here. So if you do want to go back and watch that, go do that now and then check back in with us. Okay, so these 5 factors, again, interrelate to increase shame sensitivity or shame proneness or shame intolerance, depending on how you want to phrase this. And most clinicians are going to be familiar with these to some degree or to quite a lot. They all, again, interrelate, so we need to know all of them. This first one, the primal threat response, is a very understandable one. These are common sense experiences. We all have fear. And fear obviously triggers certain reactions in the brain. We can quite simply think of these as dysregulation or overregulation. In the prior session on shame, we talked about the vagal response and how we ideally stay in a calm and centered place with the ventral vagal system. But if we're threatened, whether it's a physical or social threat, we can go up into the sympathetic nervous response, which is the kind of classic fight or flight response, which we see here on the left. Or we can go all the way up into that dorsal vagal response, which is more of a freeze response, a shutdown, a fold, a collapsing into depressive, hopelessness, sort of at the last stage of life. If I'm going to die, I might as well collapse into this submissiveness. That can be seen as an overregulation response. Ideally, we then calm down and get back into that ventral vagal safety zone. But unfortunately, the DSM categorizes these as things like with dysregulation and fight or flight, categorizes this as generalized anxiety disorder, phobias, ADHD, etc. The dysregulatory or activation or mobilization response of our fear and threat response system is medicalized into these certain diagnostic labels. But we can really see those as just dysregulation in that sympathetic nervous system. Or the other side is this overregulatory response. The fold or freeze response gets labeled as depression, major depressive disorder, schizoaffective disorder. And I think even like Asperger's or autistic symptoms are more of this freeze fold response with a sort of overregulation of the dorsal system, where underneath there's a lot of anxiety, but it's regulated into this frozen exterior. And so this is a vast simplification. There's more on my website and more in papers I've written on this and books that I've written on this, but this is a simplification that we can see that the fear response is not a disease, right? The DSM wants us to label this as a disease or a mental disorder or a mental illness, and it is not. And I get really angry when people say that things like anxiety are a disease. It's not, because, quite frankly, if we're going to label an emotion like fear as a disease, then why not label happiness a disorder? I mean, right? Joy, that's a disorder too. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make, this biomedical model does not make sense. And again, I talk about that in the first video. So if you haven't seen that, go back and check on some of the problems in the DSM and this biomedical model. So next we've got the fear of social exclusion, which is the middle one on this backpack, I call it, of normal, healthy responses. I have my little person here, but you can't see all of them or her. But this is where we have, go back, the first 3 of these 5 causative factors. We have the threat response, we have social exclusion, we have shame or shame tolerance. And I put them here as a backpack because we all have these. These are normal human experiences. And again, with clients, I love to just normalize the heck out of this when I do psychoeducation. We all have fear. Of course, we have fear. It's healthy. It's a good emotion. We need fear. This fear of social exclusion, of course, we have that. Even in our teen and young adult years, the science shows that the parts of the brain that are very concerned about social approval, they actually get bigger. They get stronger in those young adult years. Well, what do we know about those years? A lot of fear of peer acceptance, right? Peer pressure and fitting in is really, really important. And there's even an interesting evolutionary psychology reason for that. So I just normalize like heck around these kinds of things. And this fear of social exclusion is also very survival related, just like threat. Our early, ancestors had absolutely had a fear of being abandoned as infants, right? If your mother put you down and you got eaten by a predator, that was a real threat. You had to cling to mom. You had to cling to your tribe. Even as adults, if we were kicked out of our tribe in those ancient times, we might die. We might not have food. We might not have protection. And we certainly weren't going to reproduce as easily. So evolution taught us to have this strong urge for social affiliation, right? And it drives us even today when we might not die if we're kicked out of our tribe, but we still have that same threat response when we fear rejection or disaffiliation from others. When you think about one of the words for shame is mortification. Mortification, mort is the Latin word for death, right? And we even use the term social death for the fear of doing something embarrassing in public. So yeah, we relied as a social species then on these fears of social exclusion to generate moral emotions like shame. Shame, again, is a moral emotion rather, that encourages us to behave in ways that ensure our social acceptance. So we can look at both shame and compassion as these pro-social emotions, strategies that arose from human evolution because they helped encourage us to behave in ways that got us to survive, that helped us reproduce. And so these pro-social mental states and behaviors are very important to us even today. In contrast, immoral acts like greed or violence are still considered immoral, and they would lead us to expulsion. Today, they lead us to maybe jail time because they were anti-social, led us away from our social relationships. So social codes and behaviors and morals are all ingrained ways of encouraging us to behave in ways that keep us in relationships with individuals and with our group. And then it leads to a strong natural desire to avoid being shamed, right? To feel that exclusionary experience. We also have a lot of research in psychology about social rank, social hierarchies, and then the social mentalities around that. Most of us can very easily tell when we're not the top dog, right? When we're lower in the social order, and we can tell who is the top dog. And when we do embarrassing things, we fall down that social ranking, right? That pecking order. And then we want to get in the good graces of others and get higher in that social ranking. So we behave in ways that help us do that. So I always do a lot of education around this with clients so that they understand that these are, again, are very normal behaviors. Things like social anxiety are not mental disorders. They're just our natural urge to feel accepted and then to fear that disapproval, right? Approval seeking, disapproval avoidance. So we can also look at this through an attachment lens if you're educated on attachment theory. So this is, again, I like to say with social exclusion, loneliness should not be considered a mental disorder, right? We are social humans. It is natural that we seek love and connection and belonging. And if we don't get that, we're going to fear that. That is called loneliness. That should not be labeled a mental disorder. Quite frankly, if we don't fear social exclusion, we are a sociopath, right? We don't care if people judge us and have moral opinions about us. That would be a problem. That would actually be a diagnosis. So this is important to recognize. And then we have the last little backpack here, shame and shame tolerance. And again, we talked about this. Shame is a normal emotion. We all have this, and it's a good thing. It helps us behave in pro-social ways. However, we can then have factors that increase those three normal behaviors and experiences that we all have. Trauma is one of these 5 causative factors that can add on and really be in a big, heavy burden to those of us who have trauma histories. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this. If you've had any kind of training on trauma, you'll obviously, know far more than we're going to talk about here. Trauma, acute trauma and chronic trauma are widely known, widely researched, especially since the mid-90s with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACEs. Lots of research now on how interpersonal abuse or neglect or especially in early childhood causes a lot of psychological distress and physical, somatic complaints. I like to highlight that one of the ACEs questions, the 10 original ACEs questions, is shame-based. It assesses for shame directly. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? And that's very clearly a shame-related question. But we also know through the research that adult or caregiver abuse or neglect is in and of itself a shaming experience. Many people who have trauma often feel unworthy as a result of that, even if there was not an overt shaming or blaming experience from anyone else. Their natural conclusion is there's something that was wrong with me that caused that incident to happen to me. I was sexually abused or sexually molested because of my unworthiness as a human. And that translation to shame is often a common experience. Some researchers have found that trauma is harmful, not just because of the event, but because of the feeling that no one was there to support, to comfort in the aftermath of that trauma. And this recollection that no one was there, of being abandoned, is so important because it often leads someone to conclude again that I was unworthy of being supported, unworthy of being loved and cared for in the aftermath of the trauma. Some research say the absence of adequate attunement and responsiveness to the child's painful emotional trauma or physical trauma is what is so powerful in the aftermath of trauma. So that's kind of the important takeaway about acute trauma. And again, so much more to say about that, not really able to dive into that here. The fifth response to, is the fifth factor is insecure attachment history. Again, lots to say about attachment, been researched for 40, 50 years, books have been written about it, trainings all over the place on attachment patterns, attachment history. So if you're not trained in this, go get yourself on this, because this is viewed as relational trauma, right? This is where it's not just about the physical frightening experience of an acute trauma, but the relational trauma that, again, many people conclude from that I am not worthy of love and connection and support, and they relate to themselves in a shame-based way. Attachment insecurity is often about rejection. It provides a model for self, for other, that is very rejecting and shame-based. And so that's really important for us if we use this as a factor in our shame-informed model for clinical case formulations. Compassion-focused therapy focuses in its interventions. Part of this is based on what are called fears, blocks, and resistances to to compassion. Certain people who have a critical and judgmental experience with themselves have a lot of fears about being compassionate to themselves, a lot of blocks and resistances to that because they feel uncomfortable about compassion. They just can't relate to themselves in a compassionate way. And when we look at that from an attachment-based perspective, it makes a lot of sense because they never experienced a loving, caring, compassionate other, perhaps in their childhood, or rarely experienced that. So then they don't know how to translate that into a loving, compassionate relationship to themselves. They don't know how to self-soothe because they never experienced soothing as a child. So if you read about the fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion, that is, again, understandable from attachment-based work. And again, the opposite of that is a secure feeling of attachment. And this is the foundational experience that we are worthy and that we can have resilience in relationships when they go wrong, in experiences in life when things go wrong. We have a psychological resilience to those experiences. And also that we experienced a consistent, warm, soothing, emotionally attuned relationship as a child, so then we can provide that same experience to ourselves in a compassionate way. Our caregivers saw us, heard us, related to us as a worthy and worthwhile human being, so then we can experience that with ourselves and with others in our adult lives. These attachment patterns are important to recognize because they inform us about our relationship with ourself, right? We can understand the importance of that. So again, lots to say about this, not much time to talk about it. But the takeaway is that attachment trauma is essential to assess for. I find a lot of clinicians that I get referrals from, I look at their assessment, their intake note, and it's like the childhood family was normal, mom and dad, siblings, nothing to report. And yet, just a little bit of research finds that this client had a lot of attachment trauma and a lot of unhealthy relationships in their early childhood. Many aren't maybe overtly abusive or neglectful as parents. Their parents weren't, didn't trigger one of those 10 ACEs, but they were definitely not healthy parents, especially when we look at shame and blame. So very important to look at how their parents attuned to that child, related in a responsive, warm manner, and signal to that child that they mattered. That was the parent compassionate and warm or not? And that's sometimes hard to assess for because people don't know what they don't know, right? These are often the people who come in and say, oh, my childhood was good. I had a fine childhood. I had good parents. That's always a red flag for me, right? That might not be accurate. That might be a bit idealized. Someone who hasn't really examined their childhood and seen the ways that it might have been harmful or neglectful in these more subtle attachment-based ways. I often find people don't assess for a narcissistic parent, and this is a big one to look for. People don't know what that is. They don't know how to report on a narcissistic parent. But if there was a narcissistic parent in that childhood history, they for sure had an insecure attachment history, because a narcissistic parent cannot provide true attuned presence to the child because it's always about the narcissist, right? The child is often parentified and having to feed the narcissistic parent their emotional needs and satisfy that parent in those ways. And the child will naturally assume that they're unworthy of proper love and attention and become very shame-based in their relating to themselves. So very important to assess for that. Obviously assess for overtly judgmental, punitive, or authoritarian parenting. This can obviously very directly lead to feelings of shame or unworthiness in a child, a sense of powerlessness in the face of an authoritarian other, a view that relationships are threatening and shame-inducing. Okay. There is no nurturing others are only there to be punitive. And again, this will then be internalized for many people. They will become very self-blaming and replicate that model of a blame-inducing, shame-inducing parent. So again, warm acceptance from parents is essential to learn to develop this skill of warm acceptance of the self. But if you're not raised by calm, nurturing parents, the entire social world then becomes threatening, right? Others can be a source of judgment and rejection and shame. And then if you are also judgmental and rejecting and shaming of yourself, it's a double threat, right? And this is where this attachment history is so important to take, because you will see whether this person has a model of relationships with others as safe or unsafe. And then it often relates to the model they have of themselves as relating to themselves in unsafe or safe ways, compassionate or judgmental ways. So what we tend to think of with this 5-factor model is that they all load up. This backpack becomes bigger because of if people have a trauma history or an insecure history of attachment problems, these factor into these backpacks and make it extra heavy. And these are the people who come into therapy with a lot of issues because these interrelate. And that's what's important from a shame-informed model, is to look at how these factors interrelate. Again, we all have these first 3 factors: threat response, fear of exclusion, and shame tolerance issues. We all have shame, we all have fears. It's that these 2 additional factors really bulk up these responses in unhealthy ways and make them people overreactive, hypersensitive to threat, hypersensitive to fears of exclusion, hypersensitive to shame in ways that are unhealthy. And so through this, we can see, importantly, that shame is the key underlying emotion of all 5 of these, that it's the cause of essentially all of our modern psychological problems, trans-diagnostic emotion, because it relates to all 5 of these factors and is an underpinning emotion in these ways. We all respond to fear, but if we have heightened levels of shame, we're going to react to fear, not only to physical threats and reasonable social threats, but to our own internal shaming. We're going to be overly sensitive to fears of social exclusion. And that shame is like a chemical reaction that makes things worse. And so that's what's important to recognize here. So where does the DSM stand on shame in these 5 factors? Well, if you watched the first video, you know that it ignores shame. I don't think it's mentioned ever once. Maybe in the depression section, there's a mention of self-loathing. Okay, but that's it. It really is not understood as a trans-diagnostic emotion. The DSM ignores our need for human love and connection, and the love and connection we need with ourselves. It privileges intrapsychic problems and ignores relational problems, essentially. We have some personality disorders in there, and there's a few issues with relationships, but doesn't really talk about them at all. It ignores complex and attachment trauma, other than maybe reactive attachment disorder, and that's only in children, right? It doesn't address this as adults. It doesn't address this view of self or other that comes from attachment trauma. Privileges acute trauma for PTSD and acute stress disorder, but it really ignores the ACEs research throughout the DSM. And it totally ignores the shaming experiences that we know that our psychosocial environment can have an impact on, things like racism or poverty or immigrant status or gender differences. These are all ways that we experience shame that the DSM completely disregards. Takes into no account for these things. And I think that's, these seem kind of important, don't they? Kind of important, again, for our humanness. These are factors that affect our humanness, love, connection, feeling worthy, feeling belonging. So important, yet the DSM, our whole model of psychology, of humanness, ignores these basic factors. So that sure seems important to me. So this was our talk on 5 factors that I believe cause shame, intolerance, or heightened shame sensitivity. They all interconnect, they all interrelate, and we need to assess them when we do case intakes, because they absolutely will cause psychological distress that, if we use the DSM model, we would label as anxiety or social anxiety or depression or any number of other things. But I think they can be more clearly understood as being caused by these 5 factors and how they interrelate. Great. So we're going to talk next time on shame and relationships, and how shame affects relationships, not just with ourselves, but with other people, and how the DSM absolutely ignores this information. And yet it's so foundational to how we should work as clinicians, that I think it's just a major blunder in the DSM that we need to rectify. Thanks so much for joining me. Again, I'm Harper West. My website is harperwest.co. Lots more on shame, and especially shame in relationships on that website. There's a web page on there called "How Does Shame Affect Relationships?" or how does shame affect relationships? And you can check that out. Great. See you in the next video.